Welcome to Agatha Christie She Watched, the spoiler-heavy podcast in which we talk about Agatha Christie movie adaptations. This is Bill Peschel from Peschel Press, and this week we're talking about oppressed servants, drunken hunks, and nuns. Lots of nuns. This is the 2006 Poirot episode After the Funeral, starring David Suchet as Hercule Poirot. But first, let me introduce my partner in marriage and crime of the fictional sort, Teresa Peschel. How are you doing today?
Hi, Bill. It's always a thrill to be here in your little bitty office under the stairs without any windows.
That's right. It's Sunday afternoon. We had a breakfast that couldn't be beat, made by Teresa, and now we're sitting down to talk about the movie we saw last night, After the Funeral, also known as Funerals Are Fatal in the United States. So what do you think, Teresa?
I thought it worked really quite well. There were some things in there that I did not understand, and I still don't understand. I can talk about them now or we can get to them later.
We'll go on and set up the episode first by talking about the Abernethy family.
It was greatly simplified for the film. At least two of the Abernethy brothers and sisters were deleted wholesale. Mrs. Leo, that's Helen, she was childless in the novel till the very end when you discover that she actually wasn't as a result of a secret baby by a Greek lover. But that went away.
In the novel, one of those closed circle family mysteries that Agatha liked to specialize in, and we actually have it subdivided between the older Abernethys and the younger Abernethys, and you've already talked about Richard.
Okay, so Richard was the oldest of the Abernethy children, and he was very intelligent. He was a go-getting businessman, and he is the one who made his father's corn plasters business into an even bigger success than it already was.
Enabling him to buy Enderby.
Yes, enabling him to buy this magnificent castle. Corn plasters, I think, are the little patches that you put on where the corns develop on your toes because you were wearing poorly fitted shoes. And I guess that was a big deal in England because lots of people had that problem, enough that you could make millions selling corn plasters. So Richard had a number of brothers and sisters. As I said, he was the oldest. He had a younger brother, Timothy, who resented him always because Richard was successful in every way and Timothy always felt like a poor imitation. And as a result, Timothy became what you see in the novel and the book, a querulous, demanding, whiny invalid, someone who genuinely enjoys his sickbed and making other people kowtow to him because he has no power any other way.
As a matter of fact, Agatha flipped this because it was the blue geranium. You had the querulous old woman who stayed in bed and was demanding, and now we have a querulous old man who's demanding.
I think there are a lot of people like that if they have the luxury of money and family to do so. Richard also had a younger brother called Leo who married Helen. Leo is dead and has been for some years prior to the opening of the film. He had at least one other brother or sister, we aren't given the name, who was it would have been a sister because the last names don't match. He had a sister who married and who had two daughters, Rosamond. Oh, I'm sorry, let me back up. Helen and Leo had one son, George, and then Richard's younger sister, who is now dead, had two daughters, Susanna and Rosamond, and why they renamed Susan into Susanna, I don't know, when Susan actually suits her personality better than Susanna does, which sounds florid and romantic. And then the much younger last sibling, and that is Cora, who mysteriously is no longer a widow of a French painter, but is the divorced wife of an Italian painter. Again, I don't quite see the point of this, but that's what they did. Right. So it's a complicated family, and the novel actually comes with a genealogy chart so that you can figure out who's who.
So we have Susanna, who's the missionary.
Yes, Susanna is the missionary. She's a niece. Rosamond is the other niece, and she is an actress married to an actor. And you have George, who we're not given what he does. He's probably a lawyer or a stockbroker or some respectable kind of job in the city.
Played by Michael Fassbender in an early role of his.
That's right. That's right. And he is the drunken hunk. And pretty much every single time you see him on the screen, he is drinking or passed out from drunk. Not always, but in general, he is clearly a drunken, upset lout.
So we have the secondary characters, which is Rosamond's husband, Michael Shane.
Yes.
Who's an actor.
An actor with everything that goes with that.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, did we have anybody else? Of course, we have Miss Gilchrist as well.
Oh, yes. We have Maud, who is Mr. Timothy's wife, and she is long-suffering, and she is totally devoted to her invalid husband, and she does everything possible for him. him, and he takes full advantage of it.
Down to the point of fixing the car.
Yes, she is his mechanic as well as his live-in nursemaid, housekeeper, and cook. There's Miss Gilchrist, who is Cora's companion. Miss Gilchrist is one of their, what do you do with genteel older women who have no money of their own, who cannot compete in the job market, who have no way of providing for themselves? What do you do with them? Well, they become companions, which are essentially paid friends and live-in housekeepers and personal assistants to older women who have a little bit of money but who really shouldn't be on their own. And remember, in our modern age, we have things like washing machines and vacuum cleaners, whereas right up until the 1940s, every lick of housework had to be done by hand. And that is a lot of work. So you end up having a companion just so that you can get all of the heavy work done. Although Miss Gilchrist is quite adamant about this to Poirot and Entwistle, that she is an excellent cook. She does light dusting. She does not do the rough. And when she says, I don't do the rough, what she means is she's not on her hands and knees scrubbing those floors.
And she's very much insistent on distinguishing herself from the servants. And that actually becomes a plot point throughout the book.
Yes, Miss Gilchrist is treated as a servant, but she does not consider herself to be a servant. She used to be a business owner. She used to own her own little tea shop until a big chain,
Lion's Corner House.
Lion's Corner House, which I had never heard of, but think of Starbucks. So there you are, you own your tiny little coffee shop in the village, and you do pretty well, and then Starbucks comes in and opens a great big gleaming store across the street from you, and they undercut you on every single cup price, and they advertise everywhere, and your business fails, and you're out the door. And then you end up becoming a companion to a batty, unpleasant, querulous old woman, and, you know, you'd be resentful.
And as pertains to the title After the Funeral, the opening scene starts at the funeral, a crematoria, in which Richard Abernethy, who'd been ill for some time, is being cremated.
And he was ill for some time, but he still died rather suddenly, more suddenly than anyone expected. The family reassembles for the funeral, including Cora, who has been estranged from the family for a good 20 years, ever since she ran off with that Italian Loesch painter. So nobody actually really knows Cora. What they do remember is her as a girl, that Cora would say the stupid thing. Cora would say the rude thing. Cora would say the thing that everyone else is thinking, but nobody wants to say it out loud. Oh my God. Why do you have that enormous zit in the middle of your forehead? Oh my God, why is that woman so fat? I thought that she wasn't married. Oh my God, I think our oldest brother was poisoned. That he was murdered, wasn't he? That's why you had him cremated so hastily? Even though nobody gets cremated in this day and age?
Yes, and to use the title for another Agatha book, it was The Cat Among the Pigeons.
That's Cora. And no one up to that point had had any suspicions whatsoever about Richard's death. He was elderly. He was sick. It was a little bit of a surprise that he died sooner rather than later, but at the same time, he was old and sick. You can go at any time.
And that was the first of many surprises, because then the will was read.
Oh my God. The money was divided up among all of the survivors, the brother Timothy, the sister Cora, the nephew and two nieces, instead of it all going to George. Which everyone expected. And one of the reasons, of course, why Richard would have given all of the money to George is because George is the only male Abernethy. Richard had no children in the film. Leo only had the one. If there were any other Abernethy males, they're not on screen, and they did not produce sons. If you want something to stay in the family, under the family name, you better have the heir and the spare and maybe one or two more, because you don't know what will happen.
But the inconsistency in a way is that Susan, or Susanna, was apparently more related to
Richard in terms of business acumen.
She would have been better off inheriting.
She would have been much better off inheriting the whole kit and caboodle, and she would have run the company like a dream. Now, Susanna here in the film, so I'm going to refer to them by two different names. Susan is the book character. Susanna is the film character. She has lost a useless husband and where she's going to go into business as the next Elizabeth Arden. Instead, she has become a missionary to those poor, starving, uneducated native children in South Africa. And as you watch this, you want to ask yourself why, if Susanna is so concerned about poor, starving children, she isn't paying any attention to the poor, starving, ill-educated children in the rookeries of London who could certainly use the help and are a lot closer. And in a way, you see that she talks a good talk, but she doesn't really consider people, because you see her with Miss Gilchrist. And she meets Miss Gilchrist. This is after Cora's savage murder by being hatcheted. She comes out to Miss Gilchrist's cottage. Miss Gilchrist is picking up the mail, and she's got 2 bottles of milk. And Susanna introduces herself and then shoves her suitcase into Miss Gilchrist, so Miss Gilchrist can carry her suitcase into the house, even though Miss Gilchrist already has her hands full with bottles of milk.
Mm-hmm.
It never even crosses Susanna's mind that just maybe, as a good, decent, caring person, you'd carry your damn suitcase yourself.
This parallels the situation in Knives Out, because the good liberal members of the family treated the servant.
Yes, they treated the Hispanic servant essentially as a dog's body, because, hey, she's a servant. Servants have no rights. Servants have no value other than the work that they do. You claim that you actually care about the working class, then you shouldn't be bitching when your Uber driver shows up late because of traffic, or the Amazon guy didn't deliver your stuff as promptly as you wanted because something came up.
This is how Poirot is brought in. Gilbert Entwistle, the barrister, calls Poirot in and says, "This is what's happened. We need you to look into this." And this was before Cora was found dead in her cottage.
Well, no, he knows that Cora was found dead in the cottage.
That's right. He was told after. Yeah.
He knows, because what happens is we open with Poirot and Entwistle on the train. And Entwistle has essentially shanghaied Poirot out of his apartment and dragged him off into the wilds of England on the way to Enderby because, oh my God, I'm the family attorney and things are wrong. The will was completely rewritten. I couldn't understand what had happened to it. The deeds to the house were stolen. And Cora, who has an absolute genius for saying the wrong thing, but it's true, for hitting the nail on the head, said, "But Richard was murdered, wasn't he?" And then, as he's explaining all of the details to Poirot says, this is on the train, mind you, as they're zooming through the English countryside. Poirot says, "And we're on the way to talk to Cora?" And Entwistle says, "Well, not exactly. We're going to go see her, but we're going to go see her body because she's been savagely attacked and murdered with a hatchet to the face." And you think, oh, that's really suspicious.
Yes, it leads you to 2 conclusions. Either that was actually Cora or that was somebody else hatcheting the face to disguise who the true body is. After you see a lot of these movies, you start thinking like how Christie would have plotted this.
That's right. The important thing is about Cora being hatcheted, and this is something else that Agatha has used frequently, is that Cora's murder had to be disguised in some way. And if Cora was murdered because she said, "But Richard was murdered at the funeral," then obviously Richard must have been murdered too. And so you have the 2 of the deaths are intimately related. They are completely tied together. And yet, as you discover by the end, the first murder was never a murder, but it was presented as a murder to conceal the origins of the second murder. And this is the ABC murders written small, where the other murders in the ABC murders were committed to cover up the murder that mattered.
In that case, it was multiple murders to cover up the true one.
Yes.
And here it's the switching of cause and effect.
Yes, to conceal the motive and who could have done it.
Let's talk about Rosamond and Michael. They have a play that they're in, a murder mystery play.
And apparently a very bad one. And Michael thinks of himself as being a fabulous actor. And the little bit that we saw, I didn't really see anything wrong with it, but you were rolling your eyes and saying, "Oh my God, what a cheesy performance," as though he's being really laying it on thick.
Oh, absolutely. Because she has the gun. He's saying, no, don't do it. And she shoots him, and he does this exaggerated motion like a pirouette in which he throws his hand up in the air and his head back, and he twirls and falls into the seat. And
gracefully, mind you.
Very gracefully, and he dies. And then the curtain falls, and the 8 people in the audience are going, "Hey."
So that's Rosamond. She is an Abernethy, but she doesn't have the last name. Mm-hmm. You know, she didn't have the last name as a girl because her mother married outside of the family, of course. Same thing with Susanna. So she's the actress. And
they were looking forward to the inheritance so that he could buy a property that would star him and make his career. And of course, she would have a part as well.
Susanna was also looking forward when the will was read. She was equally shocked to discover that she would get money, but now she can go off to South Africa and rescue poor little native children while ignoring poor starving, children in the London slums.
Well, there's also this whole thing about starting schools for them and teaching them how to read. And there's always a question, what is their life like there? Do they need the schools? Or is it just we need to do things like the way we do in England, where we have flogging and boys' schools and rugby?
Yes, is this really going to fit well into the local culture? There's also George. George is, every time we see him, he's played by Michael Fassbender, by the way, in case he looks familiar. Every single time we see George on screen, he's either drinking, drunk, or passed out. He is apparently extremely distraught, but not necessarily because he didn't inherit like he expected to.
Yes, and he's very hostile to his mother, Helen.
Yes, intensely hostile to his mother, Helen. And eventually we learn that George is consumed with rage and guilt because Richard told him the day of his death, Richard told him, "George, I am your father." And George said, "What?" Because, of course, he had always believed that his father was Leo, Richard's younger brother. He loved his father and he loved his uncle, and they were not the same person. And oh my God, this means that Mom had a torrid affair with her brother-in-law. She cheated on Dad, and I am the result. I am the child of an adulterous whore.
Yes, I am a bastard, and despite the fact Richard is saying, I am making over my entire fortune to you, he didn't say, well, I guess I'll just go cry on my big piles of money after you're gone, Dad.
And at the same time, if he's feeling guilty about inheriting everything, he's not saying, okay, I realize I'm shocked, but I'm going to go lie down in a darkened room with a damp tea towel over my eyes, and I'm going to think about what I can do with the money. And then, maybe divide the money up between the rest of the family. Because if George inherits everything, then Timothy gets nothing, Rosamond gets nothing, Susanna gets nothing, and George's mother Helen gets nothing, and Cora gets nothing.
George is also in a turmoil as well because he's secretly, frequently in love with Susanna.
It's his cousin. Oh, and let us not forget, George also feels enormous guilt because when Richard said,
"George, I am your father."
And I can't do the Darth Vader intonation really well, but I think that's kind of the sensation that George is feeling at that moment. They had a tremendous screaming row that ended up with George storming out, knocking into Lanscombe and knocking over an entire glass full of glassware and drinky winkies. George feels that trauma, that emotional fury is why Richard had, I guess, a massive stroke or a massive heart attack and died that night. Right. Because he had made Richard so angry and so upset that his beloved uncle, oh my God, you're actually my father, keeled over dead because we had a fight.
So moving on, we get into this long stretch with Miss Gilchrist and with Susanna because Susanna decides she's going to move in with Miss Gilchrist. And then Miss Gilchrist receives a package of wedding cake from John and Mary, and she doesn't quite know who it is, but nevertheless, she's hungry, so she's eating the cake.
Yes, it's a very nice fruit cake. English wedding cakes are not American wedding cakes. And apparently what they do is they have a fruit cake, dense, rich, moist, can easily be shipped, and they're frosted with a rolled fondant, which can easily be shipped. And you get your slice of wedding cake. You eat half of it, and the rest of it you put under your pillow so that you can dream of your future husband. Mm-hmm. But Miss Gilchrist is, of course, a woman obviously in her 40s, maybe even in her 50s. She's never been married. After she lost the tea shop, she lost everything. Oh, I want to go back. The reason why Susanna is in the house with Miss Gilchrist is not because she actually is concerned about Miss Gilchrist. It's because Cora left her fortune, such as it was, to Susanna. So Susanna is there in the house. She has to, of course, give Miss Gilchrist what little tidbits that Cora decided to give her faithful companion, which was virtually nothing. And Susanna, as a blood relative, of course, gets everything else. And so Susanna there has to decide what she's going to do with the cottage. She has to decide what she's going to do with the furniture, the clothes, the bits of jewelry.
And the paintings.
And the paintings.
Of which Miss Gilchrist asks for one in particular as a memento.
Yes. Miss Gilchrist was allowed to pick out a couple of paintings. Cora, I want to say Landquist because that was her name in the book, but Cora was a painter.
Mm-hmm.
And not a very good one, a Sunday painter, but she was enthusiastic. And Miss Gilchrist makes a point of saying several times that Cora always painted from life. And we do actually get a scene with Susanna and Miss Gilchrist. A stranger shows up at the door, and it is Cora's former husband, because, of course, she had to marry an Italian painter and be a divorcee instead of marry a French painter and be a widow. Mr. Galazio was Cora's former husband, and he is relatively well placed in the art establishment. He comes out periodically to look at the paintings that Cora has bought at yard sales to see if they're any good. And he never finds anything, but once again, there was a painting that he was supposed to look at. And so he looks at the painting in front of Miss Gilchrist and Susanna and says, nope, this one is not worth the 2 or 3 shillings she paid for it. But that establishes him as an art expert and someone who is part of Cora's circle. So, of course, he is the person she would ask to come down and look at whatever it is that she bought.
Right, and all this becomes more important as the episode goes on because there's a painting of a pier that Cora painted.
Polyflexon pier, and the pier was destroyed. So apparently
Susanna questioned it because if she painted from postcards, which of course Miss Gilchrist said, no. And then Susanna said, well, in this painting, there's a pier on here and it hasn't been there for 5 years and she just painted it recently.
Yes, by the date on the painting, she just painted it recently. And also look at this postcard that I found that looks exactly like the pier, that looks exactly like the picture. Now, I did have one question about this, and I think in the novel, Cora was a watercolorist, and watercolors dry quickly. But there was the smell of oil paint. And the thing is that you have to understand about oil paint is it takes sometimes a while to dry. That's why you can go back and rework the painting for quite some time. I really find it hard to accept if you're painting with oils that you would have this entire finished painting, and it's a fairly comprehensive little painting that they got too, by the way, that you would have this entire comprehensive, detailed, slightly soft focus painting that is about 18 inches by 2 feet, and you would get it done in a couple of hours. I mean, that's a lot of detail work, and I guess if you're really good, you can be that fast, but
Bob Ross used to do this over the course of an episode, so maybe,
that's true.
She likes these happy little piers.
Yeah, I guess so. So she was drawing. She was painting happy little fishing boats and happy little clouds, and I guess so. But anyway.
But it leads to a scene, Poirot sniffing the paintings, and I guess
and detecting the smell of fresh oil paint, of fresh paint. And why is he smelling fresh paint when Cora had gone to the funeral a few days before, came back, and then the following day was hatcheted? Why is there the smell of fresh oil paint? Because apparently Miss Gilchrist, or so she claims, does not paint. And Cora has been dead for several days. She's been dead and gone. Which
leads to the grand conclusion that Miss Gilchrist was the one behind the murder.
She was the one behind the deception. Richard died, and Miss Gilchrist, remember, we only have Miss Gilchrist's word for Richard's visit to Cora. We have only Miss Gilchrist's word for what Richard said to Cora. And if Miss Gilchrist, she saw her opportunity to get her tea shop back. And the painting plays a critical role because Cora could not recognize a Rembrandt when she saw one, but Miss Gilchrist could. And if she sold this painting, she would be able to get her capital so that she could open up another tea shop. And this was another change in the novel, because in the novel, what Cora bought by accident was a Vermeer. But my guess is the reason why they made this change is because they figured the audience was far more likely to recognize the name Rembrandt and recognize the painting, because it's a very, very famous painting, than to recognize a Vermeer.
Which led to one of these things I looked at askew, because Poirot decides to take the painting and take it down to the London Academy of Arts for Giovanni to look at.
And apparently what Giovanni does is he detaches the hastily painted
painting of the pier that Miss Gilchrist
did, and underneath it is the veneer, and then he staples the canvas back in place so that Poirot can do this big grand reveal
in which
by
he takes
slicing
a knife.
off. He takes the knife blade right against the Rembrandt, the incredibly valuable, scarce, unique Rembrandt, and he is running his pocket knife alongside
the canvas to detach the canvas
that was hastily stapled back in place so he could do this grand reveal to the Abernethy family. I'm watching this and thinking, but if it's a Rembrandt, you aren't going to be taking a pocket knife to it.
You don't want to risk scraping your knife against
oh God,
a 5,000 pound valued painting in 1936.
And yes, just couldn't do it.
But there's also this whole thing, and this is the one thing we haven't mentioned, is that part of Miss Gilchrist's plan was to go to the funeral disguised as Cora, because by that time she had already hatcheted Cora's face. So
no, she did not hatchet Cora.
Really? Or was she drugged out?
Cora was drugged.
Okay.
Cora was drugged, so she could not go to the funeral, and the next day is when Miss Gilchrist hatcheted Cora. And again, this is something that Agatha hinted at in the novel, but not that much, and the film didn't really address it either, except that occasionally you had a character like the police inspector, two women alone in a cottage. You don't know how angry they will get with each other. Hatcheting is a really vicious way of killing someone.
Think of Lizzie Borden.
Yes, think of Lizzie Borden, exactly. Again, it wasn't spelled out, but it's there if you want to see it. Miss Gilchrist was really angry. She was angry at her situation. She was angry at how her life turned out. She was angry with Cora. And you do get a scene at the end where Miss Gilchrist is talking about having to live with that woman, and she had no place to go. She was trapped. She was trapped, and suddenly she had an opportunity to escape. When Cora bought the Rembrandt and didn't know what it was, Miss Gilchrist saw her chance to escape these people who all condescended to her, who treated her like a servant, and she was not a servant, she'll have you know. They treated her like dirt, including people who presumably knew better, like Susanna. They still treated her like a servant. That wasn't how Miss Gilchrist saw herself at all, and she was angry.
As I kept thinking about this after the show was over, is just, why didn't she just steal the painting or say, can I have that for my room? And it just quietly disappears. And again, you think she didn't want that. I mean, she wanted the painting, but she was also furious.
She was furiously angry, and she needed the painting, and she needed to be able to quietly walk away and not have, see, if she would have taken that painting and gone to London and sold it, then Cora would have said, oh my God, that's a Rembrandt, you owe me.
She knew in a paper what the previous Rembrandt went for. It went for that amount of money, and it was only like a couple of weeks before. It's what inspired her to do this.
Yes, and then having Richard die suddenly and conveniently, and she came up with the entire plan, not quite on the spur of the moment, but she had to make it happen pretty quickly. So she drugged Cora, and this is where the nuns come in. Nuns show up several times. Well, Miss Gilchrist, disguised as Cora, was at the funeral, making everyone think that Richard had been murdered. Nuns came to the cottage, knocked on the door. They thought they heard someone.
Yeah, they were collecting for their charity.
Yeah, they were collecting for a charity, but nobody answered the door, and so they left. But it was on their record book that they had stopped at the cottage and thought someone was home, but was unable to answer the door or refused to answer the door, and so they went away. And in fact, nuns again show up later on when Rosamond, and I thought this was actually an improvement on the text. In the novel, Rosamond discovers that she's pregnant, and she goes for long walks where she is not seen by anybody, and she decides what to do. And she decides she's going to keep her baby.
She actually does make an appointment with an abortionist, though.
Yes, but in the film, she makes an appointment with an abortionist because, oh God, I can't be pregnant. My boobs will swell and I'll get fat and I'll have this baby and it will be disgusting and I can't do this.
That's also her husband was cheating on her.
And her husband was
too.
cheating on her, the worthless, the worthless scum. You know, he's married to this beautiful woman, but no, he's got to cheat. Cheater's got to cheat. What can you say? I think this was actually an improvement on the novel, having Rosamond go to the abortionist and she sees the equipment and the bloody rags and thinks, I can't do this. I can't do this. This is my baby, and I want my baby. And she confronts Michael at the climax. She confronts Michael. There are going to be changes. And you hope that since it turns out that George faked the will to disinherit himself because he was so angry about suddenly discovering that he was Richard's son and not his own father Leo's son, and that his mother had been a cheating adulteress, that George ends up still inheriting everything, and that he will give Rosamond a healthy cut so that she's able to raise her baby. Because if he feels guilty about the money, well, the best way to handle guilty blood money is to wash it clean in charitable goodness. And that also brings me to, as I said, the will turned out to be fake, and then they found the real will. He couldn't bring himself to destroy the real will.
Actually, I have to break in because we were talking about nuns, and Rosamond wanted to talk about this with someone, and she couldn't talk about it with her husband or Poirot or the rest of the family. So she goes to the nunnery.
Yes, she goes to a convent and she talks to the nuns. And you see this scene briefly where she is with nuns. So this is why you see nuns here and there periodically. And this is also right out of the text. Nuns show up periodically in the novel.
There was a nun character in the play in that closed as well.
That's right, because Rosamond was talking about how wonderful women look in habits, and right. You think, they're not designed to be hot and sexy, Rosamond.
but it's slimming.
I guess all that voluminous black cloth is slimming, sure, whatever.
Right, but when you've seen enough Poirot episodes, you don't normally see nuns, and here we are, they're walking down the street, they show up on the stage, characters are talking to them, so naturally you get nuns on your mind.
Now, there were two paperwork issues here. One is that the will suddenly was changed and disinherited George 100%, dividing the money up among the rest of the family, which thrilled them to no end, by the way. And then it turns out that, of course, the will is false and that George inherited everything, and he changed the will because he was so distraught about being Richard's son. And all you can say is, yeah, sure. That is not in the novel, because believe me, novel George would have never said no to inheriting all that lovely money. So that's something that they did, and it didn't make a lot of sense. What made even less sense, and I still can't come up with any kind of a reason for this, is that the film had Timothy and Maud stealing the deed to the house so that it could not be sold. And this made no sense to me whatsoever, because if the house is sold, then they might actually get some money, which they need desperately. But there was no reason given for them stealing the deed. I cannot come up with a reason why they would have done that. They needed the money. Anything that slowed down probate and the sale of the house was going to cost them money.
And if it was the fact that George was going to inherit solely, because there were two wills in play here, then it just would have been simple spite.
Yeah, it would have been simple spite, but again, we don't get an explanation for that, why Maud and Timothy did it. Was it because it was spite? Was it because they hoped to move into Enderby and help themselves to knickknacks that they could then sell? You don't get any kind of a reason for this. I mean, a lot of things were revealed. You discover why George and Susanna were both in St. Lichet, and that is because they went down the day after the funeral to talk to Cora, but instead of saving Cora from being hatcheted, they were getting it on in the King's Arms hotel room, which makes Susanna, for one, feel very guilty because she's having hot sex with her cousin, but they are only cousins. That's okay in many states. Depends on the state that you're in.
Don't know how it is in England, though.
But there's a lot of cousin marriage because you want to keep the money in the family.
Ah, right.
But then there's also the issue that Poirot was suspicious of where people were, because he noticed that, and this is shown in the climax, he knew that Susanna had already been in Lichet because she knew where the hotel was in relationship to the church, and she could not have known that unless she had already visited the town, and that, of course, was the day of Cora's murder. But that's also the day that George, when he's being questioned, where were you on the day of Cora's murder? And he says, oh, I was at the track and my horses won. And Poirot asks, and what were the names of your horses? And in the novel, George didn't know because, of course, he had not been at the track. But we don't see an answer for this clue that is set up that I knew you weren't at the track because those were not the horses that won, and gamblers who win remember the names of their horses.
So as you can tell, this is a really complicated episode.
Oh my gosh,
This
it
is
was
a real
absolutely
hot play.
packed.
We haven't even gotten into the entire mirror face clue that leads to Helen getting coshed on the head.
That's right.
But we don't need to do that. We're starting to run out of time, as a matter of fact. But this gives you an idea of it.
I think it's still a good episode. It's certainly not one of the top 10, but it's not down there in the bottom like The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, which was truly terrible. It's not one of the terrible ones like Appointment with Death, which also had nuns. It's one of the middle tier. It's a perfectly good episode, beautiful clothes, beautiful sets, wonderful acting. It's a clever reveal how Mrs. Helen figures out that Cora wasn't Cora. You get to see actual Victorian wax flowers under a glass dome, although they didn't do a close-up on that like they should have.
Nice cars.
Yes, very wonderful cars. It looks good. It's well acted. The whole thing works. And it is reasonably coherent, except for why Timothy and Maud stole the deeds. It's not top tier, but I think it's definitely worth a watch.
I wish it had more emotional resonance. You had some with Miss Gilchrist, but because she's kind of off the screen and not part of the main family, you get a good shot of emotion at the end when she's just laying it out and telling this is her
so
life. She is
angry.
Furious. Absolutely furious.
She is so angry. And I guess you're supposed to get emotional resonance with George discovering, George, I am your father. I am your father, George, something like that. But we didn't get enough of him confronting his mother because they were trying to be secretive about this so that you would get the reveal at the end. But that means that you don't get George and his mother. You lied to me my entire life. You cheated on my father, and now I find out that the man I loved, that I've revered as my father my entire life, was not my father. It was some other man. It was my father's brother. How could you? How could you spread your legs for my uncle? And you don't get that at all. And you get a little bit at the end when Helen is coshed and George suddenly realizes that my mother is dying in the hospital and maybe, just maybe, I should go there and beg forgiveness for being such a wretch to my mother. But again, it isn't finished out. The thought isn't finished.
So that whole emotional resonance of that part is gone. So you kind of get the flavor of the earlier Poirots with the complicated plots and the clues, a hint of the later emotional resonance stories like you'd get in Sad Cypress.
But not enough.
Quite enough.
Not enough.
Yep.
It just wasn't emotionally satisfying enough, and that leads you to ask questions such as, why did Timothy and Maud steal the deed? And why couldn't you have spelled some of the emotional resonance? Why couldn't you have shown this to us instead of just ignoring it?
So that's pretty much...
I think that's everything I can think of.
Yeah.
I do have an ad, folks, because I just want to remind everybody that we are going to be at the Wyoming-Delaware Peach Festival on Saturday, the 6th of August, 2020, or 2022, sorry. We're going to be at the Wyoming Peach Festival on Saturday, the 6th of August, 2022. We'll be in the Sea of Canopies, so if you're in central Delaware and want to meet us, there will be.
And next time, we're going to be taking on Taken at the Flood, the next episode in the Poirot series.
That should be really interesting because that is one of the very few novels that Agatha wrote that was very much tied to a very specific date, which was 1946, after the war, the height of rationing, the world, everything in England had been turned topsy-turvy, and it is very much like N or M. It is very, very much of its time, and how they are going to move it back into 1937, I don't know. We'll find out.
We'll find out, and we'll talk about it next time on Agatha Christie She Watched. This is Bill Peschel.
And Teresa.
And we'll see you at the movies.
See you then.
Agatha Christie She Watched is Teresa Peschel and Bill Peschel. Produced by Bill Peschel. Theme song, Call to Adventure by Kevin MacLeod. New episodes come out every week wherever you stream your content. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can help support us by going to anchor.fm/mystery and leaving a 5-star rating and review, and by helping to spread the word. To advertise on Mystery She Watched, email Peschel at peschelpress.com. All questions and comments can be emailed to Peschel at peschelpress.com. And thank you for listening.